Very good morning, one and all. Today's session, we are going to discuss various areas located in the cerebral cortex. At the end of this session, you will be able to understand association cortical areas and functions of the neocortex, concept and importance of cerebral asymmetry or cerebral dominance, functions and dysfunctions of four lobes of the brain, and the cortical plasticity. Let us begin. Firstly, we have to know what is understood by association cortex or the neocortex. As we can see here in the diagram, the uppermost part of the cerebral hemisphere is labeled here as a neocortex. Phylogenetically, it is the newest part of the cerebral cortex, and as it is the newest part, hence the term neocortex has come. It has grown maximally during the evolution. It is different from other cortical areas like sensory as well as motor areas, as these areas yield no sensory evoked potential or movements whenever they are stimulated, whereas it is the neocortex that gives rise to such kind of sensory evoked on electrically stimulated. This neocortex is absent in fish, amphibians, and reptiles. It is rudimentary in birds, poorly developed in non-human mammals, and mostly developed in cases of intellect, personality, language, and speech. Learning and memory are mainly the functions of neocortex. Though the brain of porpoise, elephant, whale are larger than the brain of human, it has been found that the ratio of brain weight to the body weight in human being is much more than any other species of the animal. And this particular feature is indicating the enormous growth of the cerebral cortex in cases of human beings. Four association cortical areas overall, as we can see in the diagram, the first among which is the prefrontal association cortex, this particular one. Parieto-occipital temporal association cortex, this one. Temporal association cortex, this particular area, and the limbic association cortex, as we can see here. Frontal or prefrontal association cortex, particular area we are talking about, it consists of rostral part of cerebral hemisphere, which is located in front of the premotor area, the premotor cortex. Parieto-occipital temporal association cortex, this particular area which is extending between somatosensory and visual cortices from the above side and from below posterior portion of the temporal cortex, this particular. See, temporal association cortex, it extends from lower portion of the temporal lobe to the limbic system. Limbic association cortex, this area includes cortical areas which are associated with the limbic system. Feedback control mechanism is existing in the neocortex. There are various connections present among the neurons in the neocortex. Like other cortical areas such as motor cortex, there are presence of pyramidal and non-pyramidal cells in the neocortex. As we can see here, these are the pyramidal cells. Descending axons of these pyramidal cells are sending collaterals. These collaterals are projecting via the association neurons back to the dendrites of the cells from which they have originally originated. This is the anatomical basis of the feedback control from the neocortex. Whereas the other collaterals, they are connecting to the adjoining cells. Dendrites of the cells in the deeper layers receive input from other structures of the nervous system like thalamus, reticular formation, and other cortical areas. Neurons and their connections in the cerebral cortex have enormous capacity or ability to undergo adaptation. And this capacity to undergo adaptation is said to be the cortical plasticity. What will be the functions of neocortex? Neocortex is highly developed in humans in order to integrate higher intellectual functions like language, speech, and higher cognitive functions like ability to analyze a particular situation with proper reasoning and interact with environment according to the reason. Language function. Language and speech in humans are mainly functions of association cortex or the neocortex. However, language function is dependent more on one cerebral hemisphere as compared to the other cerebral. The one which is on which it is more dependent is said to be the dominant cerebral hemisphere, whereas the other hemisphere is said to be the non-dominant cerebral hemisphere. Due to its categorization in language function, as we said, one of the cerebral hemisphere is more potent in the language function as compared to the other. Dominant hemisphere is better referred to as categorical hemisphere, whereas the non-dominant hemisphere is known as representational hemisphere. What are the other functions? Cognition. What do we understand by cognition? It is the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through the thoughts, experiences, and various sensations. Whereas reasoning, before we say anything, we think about it, and then to do that particular thing, we necessarily use the language, said to be the reasoning. Actual sites and mechanism for this particular functions by the neocortex, like cognition and reasoning, are not properly known. Other neocortical functions are recognition of faces, calculations, navigation. Let us consider one by one. Recognition of faces, it is said to be the essential function, right? For social and emotional interaction, it is very much important. It is a function of representational hemisphere, that is usually the right hemisphere. Integration and storage of information regarding recognition of faces occur in right inferior temporal lobe, which is receiving visual inputs, particularly visual impression of faces. Lesion in this particular area, therefore, is resulting into a condition called prosopagnosia, which is inability to recognize faces. Person can recognize known people by their voice, but not by seeing their faces. Next is calculation. There are two brain areas which are involved in arithmetic calculation. First is inferior part of the left temporal lobe, which is concerned with actual calculation. This particular one. And the second is area around the intraparietal sulci. This particular area of the parietal lobes of both the sides are the areas which are concerned with memorizing numbers and finger counting. Lesion of the frontal lobe is therefore resulting in acalculia, that is impairment of mathematical ability. Next function is navigation. What do we understand by navigation? It means sense of direction finding. It is a spatial skill, and areas involved in the navigation are right side hippocampus, which is concerned with learning, and right caudate nucleus, which is concerned with the movement. Cerebral asymmetry or cerebral dominance. What is this concept is? We know there are two cerebral hemisphere, and it is the ability of the two cerebral hemisphere to serve different discrete kind of function, especially function of language and speech in humans are more localized in one cerebral hemisphere than in the other. The one in which it is more localized is said to be the dominant cerebral hemisphere, whereas the other is the non-dominant cerebral hemisphere. And because of the difference in serving the function by these two cerebral hemisphere, the term is given, that is cerebral asymmetry. Let us study in detail the basic concept between dominant hemisphere and non-dominant hemisphere by just comparing and contrasting the features of the two. Dominant hemisphere, it is the hemisphere which is concerned with language function, whereas the other hemisphere, which is not that much concerned with the language function, is said to be the non-dominant. Due to this categorization, in language function, it is also called, that is dominant hemisphere is also called categorical hemisphere. It is rather more focused in function which are concerned with visuospatial relations. What kind of function? Recognition of faces, drawing pictures, identifying various objects by their form, recognizing musical themes, and so on. And hence, it is also called as the non-categorical or the representational hemisphere. Apart from this, dominant hemisphere is usually the left hemisphere, whereas non-dominant hemisphere is usually the right. It is specialized for verbal and sequential processing of higher function, whereas the non-dominant hemisphere is specialized in non-verbal, non-mathematical, and non-sequential processing of higher functions, like we have mentioned here. It mediates mathematical learning, whereas the non-dominant hemisphere mediates the musical perception. Though we are labeling it as a non-dominant hemisphere, it does not mean that it is less developed as compared to the dominant hemisphere. It is not only language and visuospatial function that exhibit preference for their location in one hemisphere, but also the other functions which, like volitional control of movement, which is integrated more in the left motor cortex. Asymmetry exists also for the cognitive and other higher functions in the cerebral cortex, and this was for the first time observed by surgical section made in the corpus callosum. It is said to be the complete brain preparation, or also in cases in whom there was congenital absence of the corpus callosum was. Roger Sperry, a founder of split brain preparation, noted in the year 1950 that intellectual left hemisphere is highly evolved and a relatively retarded right hemisphere generally lack higher cognitive function. What is the relation of hemisphere with the handedness? As we know, about 90% of the human population is right-handed. In this 90% population, about 96% individual left hemisphere is categorical or dominant, whereas only in 4% of the right-handed population, right hemisphere is dominant. Left-handed, remaining 10% of the human population is left-handed. Out of this 10%, 70% in 70% left hemisphere is dominant, in 15% right hemisphere is dominant, and in other 15% there is no clear-cut lateralization of the hemispheres. And so we can see that in right-handed as well as in left-handed, the dominant hemisphere is predominantly the left hemisphere, and therefore the left hemisphere is often regarded as the dominant here. Specialized in language function, that is meant for vocalization and for speech, and right hemisphere as non-dominant hemisphere specialized in visuospatial function, that is meant for cognition, recognition of. It has also been observed that language disorder are more common in left-handers, though they are more talented in spatial functions like music and the various. What is the anatomical basis for functional differences between the two hemispheres? Planum temporal, an area which is located in the superior temporal gyrus, as we can see here in this particular section of the brain. This particular area is a planum temporal. It is involved in language-related auditory processing, and this particular planum temporal area is significantly larger, as we can see in the diagram. It is larger on the left side as compared to the right side. So, reduction in the size of this planum temporal area can be correlated with the degree of disorders of the language. It has also been confirmed by imaging studies that upper surface of the left temporal lobe is the area which is primarily concerned with the speech and language functions, and it is larger in right-handed individuals as compared to the left. That was the anatomical basis. Now, the biochemical basis for functional differences between the two hemispheres, neurochemical basis or the biochemical basis of language and other cognitive function is not that much clearly known, but we can say that dopamine concentration is found to be very much high in nigrostriatal pathway on the left side of basal ganglia in the right-handed individuals. What will be the effect of lesions then? Small lesion of the language area in categorical or dominant hemisphere will lead to significant language deficit, whereas widespread lesion of the same areas in other hemisphere, that is representational hemisphere or non-dominant hemisphere, no significant language deficit will be lesion in the parietal lobe of representational hemisphere leads to visuospatial deficits like astereognosis and agnosias. Agnosias is in the sense loss of various kind of sensation, and astereognosis, we have studied this during when we studied the dorsal column part. Astereognosis, what is stereognosis? It is identification of objects just by feeling their form or their texture when the eyes are closed. And this particular sensation, when is not present, the condition is labeled as astereognosis. Lesion of inferior parietal lobule in representational hemisphere leads to unilateral inattention called hemi-neglect syndrome. These individuals ignore stimuli which are originating from contralateral half of their bodies. Though they do not have any primary visual, auditory, or somatosensory deficit, in severe cases, these particular patient or individual do not dress half their bodies, do not shave half their faces, they do not eat from half of the plate, or even read only half of each page. Mental depression is very much common in such patients with diseases affecting categorical hemisphere, whereas patient may be euphoric when the diseases involve representation. What is the physiological significance of this categorization, dominant and non-dominant, or of the cerebral asymmetry? By distributing important functions separately between the two hemispheres, possibly the nature has effectively doubled the capabilities of the brain for its given size. In our next class, we will be getting familiar with different lobes of the cerebral cortex and what are the efferent connections of the different lobes, and depending on this connection, what functions they are bringing about, and whenever there is lesion in the particular lobe, what will be the effect of lesion, what condition, what clinical features they are going to give rise will be discussed in very much. Thank you so much.